So there are different arrangements here for various iterations of the Retina IIIC series. Basically the earlier ones had an extra guide bush that sat on top there, and in the later ones the front standard served as the guide bush. I'm just checking that dropped onto the gear. It did not. This means my shaft is out of line somewhere. It's way over there. That's better. Now it's coupled to the shaft at the rear, which I can see down this groove here, but you probably can't. So that's all in position. I put a wee wipe of synthetic grease on there to lubricate all the mating surfaces, and this is held in place with 2 chrome plated screws, and the screws are easily damaged and are often damaged. If one of them's prettier than the other one, make sure the one in this position is the pretty one, because the other one cannot be seen once the camera is assembled. This one can. Checking that the focus is still smooth. There's a certain amount of play here, and if this is pushed in too close you'll find that it might rub on the scale. But that's done, that's happy. I can think about putting the front door on. Before I do that, I want to assemble the rewind, and I'll show you why in a minute. So I'll lubricate the inner section of the rewind shaft. It slides in there. It's got a small spring detent in there to stop it sliding too loosely. Get that lined up with its slot, and that should pull all the way through to there. I'll lubricate the bush with some synthetic grease. And fit the shaft in place. Check that that moves smoothly. It does. Put this in the camera body. 2 screws. As usual, get both installed before you tighten anything up. Once they're both in place, you can tighten them up. Yeah. I'm just going to collapse the front. There's a return spring in this particular case that goes on the shutter here. So I can slide out my shutter release shaft, and I'm going to lubricate this with a wipe of molybdenum paste in this case. You never need much of this. Just putting a dirty mark on there really. That goes in from the top. And I've got this front collapsed because it's very easy to displace this piece and have it fall down the back of the bellows. Now I've got to feed that spring in there over the shutter release shaft as it passes through. And that's all sitting there in place. You can probably see that return spring in here. Now, if we did nothing and we tipped the camera upside down, this shaft would probably fall out, in which case that spring would have instantly redirect itself down behind the bellows somewhere and cause me intense amounts of pain and anguish. So we don't do it. The easiest answer at this point is to take a rubber band and just put that over the top of the rewind there across to the shutter release, just to stop it from falling out. Now the front can open and close nicely. You can hold the camera upside down. There's no danger of anything falling out and causing me trouble. So I'm going to fit the front door now because I want to see if it opens and closes smoothly, since that was our main and obvious problem. So I'll put a smear of synthetic grease in there and in there. Take the door, slide that into position. Now there are at least 2 spacer washers in those hinges. Now the thicker one in this case would have been at the top, and 1 or possibly 2 at the bottom. I'll find out if we need 2 when I get to that stage. So I'll get that screw started. That can be done up. And at the base of the camera, by looking at the space that's available there, I think there was only 1 washer in there, so we'll put 1 in. Slide that into position, lining up the hole. Here's our hinge pin screw. That went in without a fight. Okay, the moment of truth. Okay, it opens and shuts smoothly. There's no stiff point in the action. So that problem with the opening and closing was definitely down to the damage on this shroud piece here, the guide rail on that shroud, and it's been dealt with. It's all good. So now I can turn my attention to other things. I think the first thing I'll do is I'll put the tripod socket and so forth in there, because then it means I can put this down on the bench otherwise without pressing the button. Otherwise what happens is as soon as you put some pressure on the top of the camera, the button hits the bench and the back door pops open and becomes very annoying. Of course I haven't got all the screws out ready to go because I'm not that well organised. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that screw there, obviously did that job, but that's not one of the original screws. See, these ones are only threaded most of the way down their shaft. This one's threaded all the way down the shaft. That is a foreigner. It was either introduced at the factory or it was introduced during a previous service. We'll blame a previous service. I'll find a screw that matches the original. Right, now we have 3 matching screws. We'll use them. So first this bush goes in place. That just supports the film cassette, the end of the film cassette, and then we've got our 3 screws here. These screws can typically be distinguished because the heads on them are usually got some slight corrosion on them and or adhesive. These have been through the ultrasonic cleaner, so they're not so obviously dirty. This one here from my parts has not been through the ultrasonic cleaner and it's got the remains of some adhesive on it. That won't cause me any grief at all. Right, so that's good. Now it means when I put this down on the bench, the back doesn't spring open and annoy me. And I can get onto the film advance, which is the next section to deal with. Right, we'll start with a bit of the assembly, I suppose, of the film advance mechanism next. So, start by using a bit of molybdenum paste to lubricate where the release lever and lock lever will run. And the spring on the end of the release lever runs up and down against the body there. I'll run some down there, and there, and there. And I can see that my Rubber band here is trying to get away, so I'll just loop that back over itself again. I do not want that shutter release button getting away. So the lock lever. The lock lever's job is to lock the film advance when the frame counter reaches number 1. I'll put its return spring on there. That's not the right one. There are 2 springs, and it's the lighter of the 2 springs is the one I want there, and it's doing its best to get away. So hold that shaft up from underneath with my finger, compress that spring down with my thumb, pick up the clip with a pair of tweezers, slide it into place on the shaft, press it home with the tail of my tweezers, and there's my lock lever in place. The release lever, there's a spring on the base of the release lever which keeps it in contact with the cam. That needs to be hooked back into place because I took it off while I was cleaning the components, because otherwise it's likely to get damaged. So I'm going to get this hooked in place, and it's only marginally awkward. Check that spring is seated correctly around that boss. That looks good to me. Pop that into the body. Now take care at this point that it falls down into the cavity, doesn't get caught on the edge, otherwise you will end up bending the spring and having to disassemble it all to put it back together. Is this video camera keeping up? I can't see yet. I'm getting tired of watching the action on the tiny screen on the back of this camera while I'm videoing, but I have a solution coming, I hope, so I can have a large monitor running behind me, or behind you, in front of me, so I'll be able to see what's happening. It'll give me a much better idea of when I'm in frame and when the camera's focused correctly. Let's get this screw in the top. That'll do. So our release lever's in position. Film advance shaft. This needs to be lubricated. I'm going to use some graphite grease here, and I like the this particular graphite grease. It is very good at staying where it's put. It's quite sticky, I suppose you'd say. I'll lubricate the spring on there. Now this return spring for our film advance, that has to be tensioned when we assemble the film advance mechanism. Now if you over tension it, it'll reach the point where instead of working better it starts working worse, and that's because the coils on the spring will start binding up, and instead of moving smoothly it'll move roughly or not at all. So taking our take up spool, there's a bush, metal bush that goes into the base of that. That can go to the back of the camera. Right, I'll just lift my lock lever and swing it out of the way. Just looking at the state of my film advance here, making sure that the holes, the mounting holes here, are in line. Everything's just sitting neutral at that point. And I know from experience that if I start it in that neutral position, drop it into its normal position, like that, I'll need one full turn of advance on that spring to tension it, and it'll work well. Get that screw started. That's not going in square. Let's get another screw in there and go back and have a go at that. That screw went in well. That one went in well. Let's get this one back out and restart it. No, it doesn't want to start. Yeah, it's going in now. Okay, all three screws in position. Tighten them up. That's good. Check that that's film spool moves, that everything's fallen into place. That's great. So the clutch assembly needs to go in here now. The clutch assembly is 3 pieces, and I lubricate this with graphite grease too. So I'm applying some graphite grease to the outer section, the gear piece. The spring has got a little tab on it which engages with a notch here. If I get these crimp lug pliers on there loosely, I should be able to compress that spring gently. The tab is still engaged with its slot, is it? Yeah, just. If I rotate that, it'll pull the spring in, compressing it all. Then if I hold it there and slide the outer down in place, yeah, it's all of a piece. This moves smoothly in one direction, stiffer in the other. As it happens, the smooth direction is the correct direction anyway, so that's all good. You cannot assemble that back to front. And this goes in place. And rotate that, and that'll pick up the slots in the top of the film take-up spool. There we go. And now I want the guide bush for the top of the film advance. So I better get that sorted out. And I see I've got graphite grease all over here, so I'll clean that up before I spread it across the entire room. And I've got to change this video battery. Right, taking some synthetic grease. I'll force some into those 2 pinions there. Run some round the centre where it sits over the shaft. And drop this into position. I rotate that take-up spool with my thumb. That should fall into place and engage with the gear. It does. There's a shoulder screw on this side that actually supports the shutter cocking rack, and on the other side you have a little ratchet pull that goes on this. There's a standoff there. Now it should be plain side up, countersunk side down. If you mess that up, it's not going to go well for you. Here's that little ratchet, pull, and I'll put a touch of synthetic grease on the shoulder screw that runs through that lot. That looks good. Just tighten that up. The pull moves freely. And the return spring for that pull can go in place. That's good. That pull is returning as it should. Now this gear that goes on the top, I'll put a bit of synthetic grease in there and a wipe through the centre where it runs around the thing. Now if I rotate this anti-clockwise, it should push the pawl out of the way and move into position. It does. And I'll just point that directing to the front, checking that this is in its neutral position. That all looks good. Now I'll just pop this tripod surround underneath the film advance. That stops the shaft from pushing down while I'm busy assembling stuff. Now this spring, I usually give that a light wipe with the grease to protect it from corrosion more than anything else. That's the piece it drives. That drive dog, that washer, this little pinion, and this screw, for which I have this whopping great screwdriver. And that down slowly so I don't disturb the position of that gear on the top of the shaft, and just nip that screw up lightly. Okay, so that part's all assembled. And at the base of the camera I need to get the lever in place that locks the rewind button.